Kyle Sammons, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
I appreciate it, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. I think
Yeah.
that's the most in-depth little conversation I've had pre-podcast in a while, which I absolutely loved. We should have pressed record when we were having that little chat, or maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
no,
anyone,
I think so.
anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a little rundown of what you do now, and then working backwards to what you've done previously?
Yeah, no, I'll give you a quick rundown. So obviously my name's Kyle Sammons. I work at the Arizona Cardinals right now. My title there is Coordinator Sports Science Assistant Strength Coach. This is my third season. Previously, before this, I worked in a wearable tech company for 11 months actually at Strive Tech, which was highly beneficial for what I'm doing in the field now. And then before that, I was 7 years at University of Washington up in Seattle, working with football only. Um, 2018 to 21, I was director of sports science and reconditioning, essentially a strength coach. Before that, I was an assistant strength coach. So I was a 7 year time there, worked with Chris Peterson and that whole crew, which was amazing. And then previously before that, I was at University of Nevada for 5 years down in Reno by beautiful Lake Tahoe. Um, and I was in charge of men's basketball, women's track, and then I assisted with football. And then before that, I was a college athlete. So I played college football, University of Nevada, played wide receiver, and I think my path has been kind of shaped by that because I dealt with some injuries during and after playing, which kind of bled me into where I'm at now. But that's kind of my rundown, quick and dirty version.
Were you decent?
Yeah, that's pretty good, I think.
Okay, yeah, I
I
love that.
transferred from a junior college, so I think going from a junior college, I was there for 3 semesters, playing 2 seasons, where you have really nothing and you have to bus everywhere. So like the story I always tell is like we bus 7 hours for a night game and then bus back. So imagine that. It was like a 12-hour trip. But yeah, it was pretty decent, I feel like. Um, I played 2 years at University of Nevada. One of the years I was hurt. So really 3 years I played. 1 year I redshirted, which means I didn't play, and just rehabbed. And then finished out pretty decent stats, I feel like. But yeah, then I went into the work field.
Nice. I'm interested to the sports tech, like move away
Yep.
from directly working with athletes into sports tech and work and moving back. I think that's an interesting one, especially from here in the UK. Not many people do that here. I think people feel like maybe it's just lack of jobs. I'm not quite sure, but if you leave, you're going to really struggle to get back in. But I think in the US, like, there's a few people that do it. The guy Roderick at
Yeah, the
Steelers.
Falcons. Oh, Steelers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Robert Moore. So
Yep.
he's done it. Like a few other people have done it. What was your reason for doing that? Was there a particular reason, or was it just circumstance?
That's a great question, actually. It wasn't by choice. So we got let go at University of Washington at the end of the 21 season. It was late in hiring cycles already. It was right before Christmas. And so it's kind of not a great time to be let go. And luckily, the people I've crossed paths with and, you know, guys that I've got to know on a personal level went to bat for me. And Strive Tech was looking for kind of like a sports scientist, the best way to put it. And so that's where I jumped on board. And I really had no idea what to expect, but I think it was the best thing for me. And the reason I'm saying that is because you have a team, you work for a team, and that's your identity. And so when that identity is taken from you, you kind of lose sight a little bit and you feel like a nobody and you kind of have to re-find yourself again. And I did that. And I'll be honest, I struggled with that for about 3 months. But working at Strive, meeting business people, and then working actually with Matt Howley, who was another team side individual, both of us together would go into teams. And it was almost like we worked for multiple teams now. And so I learned a lot being removed from the team. So how do team dynamics work? What are teams trying to do? What are the barriers? What are the barriers from a tech standpoint to a team side? So that really helped me. Um, I also learned a lot about surface EMG. So that was highly beneficial. Just learning more about muscle physiology and how I can apply that to what I do now, We don't use it currently, but at the end of the day, like learning about it and the roots of what activation really looks like from EMG with force behind it, highly fascinating.
Are they still going? Is Strive still going?
Think so. Yeah, I think they
Okay.
are. They have pivoted a few times.
Yeah.
I think they're still going, yes.
Okay. Nice. Okay, so the first main thing that I want to talk to you about, and this was a little bit of digging that I did online of you, and like we said, even in the chat before, and not got a massive social media presence, which is great for me because if I didn't have to, I definitely wouldn't. So I'm definitely in your court there. But I came across the Beast Factory Framework.
Yeah.
Give us a bit of an insight where this developed, and just let's dive in.
Okay. So this started at University of Washington. And so it was 2018, kind of pivoted to more of like the director of sports science. There's also a piece of like working with injured athletes. This is before like the reconditioning space got really big, and became really a thing. Our head coach, our head strength coach were very forward thinking, and they knew that there's a space that was going to need to be filled with tech and injuries. And so that's kind of where this reconditioning space came to life. So, with that being said, unfortunately, we dealt with some injuries. 1 year towards the end of our time at Washington, we had some Achilles ruptures. We had two Achilles ruptures in 5 days, and this was during our spring ball. And so, no one in the building really had worked with Achilles injuries. I hadn't, and so I was fortunate enough to be tasked. Hey, would you mind helping rehab these guys? So, sure. And the way I kind of operate is, if I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to try and dig as deep as I can go to figure everything out on some level to figure out where to start. And at that point in time, I had an assistant. His name's Aaron Sanchez. He's now up at Seattle U, and he's doing a tremendous job. But him and I were the ones that pretty much formulated this like Beast Factory, and we were very scientific. We were like, it's the neuro-mechanical framework. And when you go and talk to athletes and you tell them that, they're like, what does that even mean? And so we're like, you know what? As we got going through this, they just started saying it's the Beast Factory. And I'm like, why? And they're like, because we're turning into like freaks, dude. Like, we are operating a certain way. And this wasn't, a knock on anybody. It was just like we were diving into doing different stuff and really attacking at a tissue level. And that is kind of where the growth of the Beast Factory started. It was working with these Achilles injuries and taking them from, rupture to them playing in their first game, which took 6 months. And people hear that and they like freak out and they're like, whoa, 6 months, that's pretty dangerous. And we had all the data to prove it. There was nothing negligent about it. It was all driven by the athlete and the medical people. And at the end of the day, they actually exceeded all these benchmarks that we had laid out for them at that time frame. And so long story short, the Beast Factory was born at University of Washington back in 2020, 2021-ish, so about 4 or 5 years ago. And kind of the methodology is you attack it from the tissue, the joint, the whole limb, then the whole body. So you're kind of taking a very micro to macro approach. Whereas I feel like in today's society, a lot of the programs in general are very macro, multi-joint, multi-movement, stuff like that. And I think there is a lot of benefit from single joint training. And it's just a matter of when you do that.
Shocking. You say, I think that will. That's going against common, like you said, it's going against common S&C practice.
Mm-hmm.
When you speak to people about that, what feedback do you get? Do you get lots of
Rob,
questions?
holy smokes, their eyes
get
get
people
about
angry?
as big as saucers, and they're like, "You do single joint training?" And so what we just kind of tell people, and I tell people, especially when I talk about this, is going and doing this, and then actually using EMG after the fact. It just solidified it even more. And what I'm saying is, when you start meshing all these joints together, you don't really know where those forces are going. You don't know which tissue is being stressed. When the joint speeds pick up and the joint velocities pick up, those limbs are just doing their jobs and the tissue is just responding a certain way. And it's really not muscular tissue. It's more or less like the connective tissue, the collagen, the fascia, whatever you want to call it, and the tendons. Whereas when you start going into actual like single joint training and stressing the tissue a certain way, you're making the tissue respond because you're adding constraints. They have to do things a certain way. And then you start stacking these other joints on top. And let's be honest, their torque starts to go up. They start to feel a certain way. They don't have any stress shielding anymore. And so it's helping the scarring. So I'll leave it at that.
Just to confirm that this Beast Factory framework, that's not just for returning
No.
players to performance. That's okay.
And I always get that question. It makes me kind of like, it's kind of like nails on a chalkboard. And it's like,
sorry.
no, I think it's a great question. It's because of the space I'm in. Like I'm more in the reconditioning space now, and I've dealt with injuries. I always say, if you can work with injured athletes, you can work with healthy athletes. And I think the question should be asked, what is a healthy athlete in today's environment? Because on some level, these athletes have had a strain, a sprain, a rupture, a bone break. That's all going to alter the internal workings. So that's the intramuscular coordination. That's the intermuscular coordination. That's the force transfer. So once we start breaking it down, it just makes perfect sense to me and to Aaron, who helped. Like, we were like, man, this is insane. Like, these dudes that were hurt exceeded their max velocities by 120% within six months. They had no issues. They didn't have any setbacks. They didn't get hurt again. So the re-injury rate was 0. So, and I've had a lot of other cases that I've worked with that have had very similar responses.
Let's dive into that, because I think there's another hour just on this section alone, rather than touching on the points. So in terms of the kind of first rung on the ladder of the neuro-mechanical framework, as you mentioned it, which is working at a tissue level, bring that to life for us. What does that actually look like? What are you doing with the guys?
Yeah, so think of isometrics are massive right now. Think of an isometric. Now we also have to break that down. What type of isometric? And so what we're looking at is one joint. There's 2 segments that connect, superior, inferior, right? Like it's so proximal, distal. Think end ranges. And so you're thinking shortening the tissue first. So if you're looking at Achilles, that's plantar flexion. And so that's unloaded plantar flexion, just literally holding end range and trying to get as far as you can into plantar flexion to find the calf, more so the medial gastroc. And you'll notice athletes, they really struggle with holding the intensity and the intent of a contraction for time. So the impulse starts to climb a lot, and they're not used to that. And so that's like the first rung is unloaded single joint. And then once they can tolerate that for a few sets, where there's no more force tremors, as we call it, then you can start adding more load. And I think load is a relative term we should probably dive into a little bit. It doesn't always mean external load. There's a ton of internal load you can create through rigging of a system by just holding isometrics.
Take us on to the next. What comes next?
So then after that,
let's go through that framework, obviously step by step to a certain extent. What comes next?
Of which
the
phase?
neuromechanical framework. So we've kind of gone
once
tissue.
you go through,
how does that move?
Like isos, it's concurrent training, so it's not block training. And so what you're going to do is stack another trait. And the next trait is you're adding eccentrics, which a lot of people think you got to do super max first. No, you can do something called an EQI, eccentric quasi-isometric. And that's Dustin Aranchik's work. And he's done great work with that. And that's literally where this thing started. Is we read a paper by him and we're like, hold on, like you're lowering a weight for 40 seconds. Like this is going to have huge tissue implications. Not to mention, we started formulating ideas from biomechanic lenses. Once you start picking up joint speed, what happens? Eccentric strength has to climb. The eccentric stretching of a tissue has to climb. So the eccentric ability of tissue is starting to put more stress, which not necessarily you want right away. So you go slower, which is adding more tensile load. And so you go from like literally no joint movement to very slow joint movement with some external load, which could be them now standing. Doesn't need to be external like as a barbell. So now you're getting gravity to push you down. And then once they're good there, then you can start doing faster stuff. So literally you go from 40 seconds down to 5 seconds. You can start adding more load to get into supermax areas. And then you can go into fast eccentrics. Think more like RFD, braking. And then you go into plyometrics, which I'll be honest, Rob, like the longest time points is laying the foundation. And laying the foundation is making sure there's no more scarring in the tissue or minimizing it. So you're getting the collagen fibers to realign just so they don't have any issues with the length tension relationship in that muscle so it can do its job. And then you're adding some length to the tissue so then the actual contraction velocity can pick up. So you're getting it ready for the next steps down the road, which is running.
So post eccentrics?
So you go
faster eccentrics.
faster eccentrics. And that can then turn into coupling, which is not just braking eccentrics. Now that's eccentric concentric with lighter loads. So what you're just looking at is a joint velocity dial. So just think like time and or speed and posture, and you're just cranking the thing up or down, up or down. And you're going from no joint, slow joint, faster joint to the fastest. And you're just working through that. And you never will just do one trade, as I call it, which is you're never just going to do just pure fast eccentrics. And the reason is because there's a lot of motor learning with the first two phases. No joint, slow joint it's very conscious movement, as we call it. In a sense, you can feel everything, you can think about everything, you can feel muscles working, but you're also desensitizing areas. And then you're actually building a model in your brain to, when you pick up speed, it's going to become more natural. So think like motor patterns, motor control.
If someone said single joint exercises, in the first thing, whether that's right or wrong, the first thing that comes to my mind is fixed resistance machines.
Yep.
Right or wrong? Is that, in terms of exercise selection to bring all this to life, is that what you're doing? Okay.
I will be honest. The best machine we had when we were at Washington was a leg extension, leg curl machine that you could fold the seat down or up. And we freaking dusted that thing off to the point, like I think the thing was broke, but it was a really good way to train these Achilles guys up the chain. So we got to make sure the proximal muscles, the thigh muscles, the hamstrings are getting strong. So when they stand and start doing stuff, it can actually do its job to support the pelvis. And then you start working down the chain when they're doing unloaded ISOs. So you're working back and forth. So you're working distal, proximal, proximal, distal. And it's just going to come together at one point, and that came together about 2.5 months where we started using the 1080. We started cranking up the resistance, got to 30 kilos, and all of a sudden they took off and ran. And we're like, whoa, like, what the heck? At 2.5 months, they're yanking 30 kilos and they're hitting about 1,500 watts within 10 yards. And then they got to above that pretty soon after that. And so this whole like Achilles talk I gave on behalf of 1080 a few years ago as well. And so I think it sounds very simple, but there's also about a few hundred research articles behind the stuff that we've put together. It's just I've had to make sure I can explain it very simplistically.
Of course. So in terms of using those examples you've used, explained there with non-rehabbing athletes,
yeah,
nothing changes.
No, and
very
I think
similar.
it just
in terms of the single joint stuff I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, I think take a football player coming up a long season. It's kind of like the GPP phase that everyone always talks about, right? So this is GPP. You're going backwards and you're doing stuff that's non-specific training from a joint perspective of speed and or coordination, which I could probably argue that there is some carryover, but at the end of the day, you're kind of going backwards and you're going to a so-called open chain environment where it's a leg extension, a leg curl, and then you're going to do some other stuff. But it sounds weird, but man, the response you get from these athletes is crazy.
How did the athletes that have gone through this?
Yeah.
I'm guessing they've maybe come through high school, come through college. It's all squatting, deadlifting, bench pressing, and then they're going on the leg extension, leg curl. What is that? Which I know you're laughing, but the perception could potentially kill you as a 100% practitioner. So how do you navigate that?
So I'll be honest, like looking at it without like diving into just simple like Newton's laws, it's going to look weird. I know that. But if you take somebody that's been doing multi-joint training and you throw them on, say, a leg extension machine and say you have to hold at 0 degrees flexion, so full extension for 30 seconds with load, you're going to find out really quickly what their capabilities are. And all you're going to do is allow the nervous system to get supercharged. So the neural drive of those muscles by holding that intense contraction is insane. And that's where leaving UW, going to Strive, using Surface EMG to actually look at muscles through the lens of, okay, when I do these things or these postures for time on a machine, multi-joint, what happens? And I think there's a lot of misnomers in a sense. We think these muscles are working doing X, Y, and Z until you throw that EMG on, you're like, what just happened? And so why I'm saying this is because like the intramuscular coordination is a really big piece. Getting the brain to fire those muscles really intensely, to make change in the tissue, to add stiffness to the tendons, to the actual muscle, to increase the intramuscular um, load, to then allow it to go do multi-joint stuff.
This may be so basic in this question, but in the use of Strive on these kind of single
Yep.
joint exercises, like extension, like curl, for example, what kind of variability is there between athletes in terms of the activation of the muscles that you want to actually work? Can you grade them, so to speak? Like this exercise, we're looking at between X and Y, knowing
Yeah,
that 99.9% of people are going to fit there.
yeah, I think that's a really good question. And we didn't get to a point where it was standardizing it like you're talking about. It was more or less throw the shorts on, have them do whatever it might be, and just look under the hood. Can they fire those muscles for time? And can you get that actual giant impulse over time? Yes or no? Or do you have that quivering where it starts to tail off, which a lot of guys do? And so you can just repeat that over time just to see. And I know a lot of people have pushed back and say you need to standardize it, which, yeah, we probably should have. But at the end of the day, we didn't. And so it was just more N of one, looking at the muscles, just N of one. Is there an imbalance? Yes or no? How much force is going through that tissue with load on, say, leg extension? And then you kind of just walk them through it. And they'd add more load as time went on. And I'll be honest, they started feeling way better. Their knees didn't hurt. So kind of now bleeding into a lot of research that's been done on, strain of tendons. That's where this has kind of like made its hay.
The last point on the list that I sent you, which was gleaned from a number of different places, was shifting traditional training paradigms. I think this fits into what we're just talking about here. But one thing that I'm going to bring in the conversation that we had 15 minutes prior to hitting record, and where you've kind of developed your philosophy and where you have, I suppose, had the maybe freedom, maybe the wrong word, but balls, another word, to do this kind of thing that is different to what the college down the road are doing, like the people that have won the championship are doing, and go, no, we believe this is gonna be the way forward. And like we said beforehand, that's a lot of that is shaped by the people that you have around you, you've grown up with. But how did that develop for you?
That's a really good question, Rob. And I'm never afraid to try stuff. And that's where I think the strength conditioning profession, I think sometimes is afraid to try stuff. I wasn't, because we had these Achilles guys, which then there was a lot of other, not a lot, but there's a few other injuries after that too that I worked with. And the response was just as insane. And I think what we did is just strip down the whole entire environment in a sense. Let's look at human bodies. They're a structure, right? Just like a house, just like a building. Don't look at the exercises, look at how they function. So look at the joints, look at the muscles, look at the brain, look at the nervous system. And if we can start attacking the nervous system to fire muscles harder to increase the motor outputs through the motor units being activated, why wouldn't you do that? And I think we've fallen into traps where it's just add more load to bars, heavy loaded bars is going to do that, until you start looking at like injuries, soft tissue, stress shielding, big scar tissue. Like then you're starting to wonder like, maybe we have to try something new. And that's where that Dustin Aranchek, like credit to him, and I've reached out to him numerous times. It was that EQI article, but also he had an article that was a review on isometrics. And it was a massive review on isometrics. And a lot of them were around the plantar flexor muscles. And the improvement he had, or not him, but the research he was combing through in that review study would show. And so me and my assistant at the time, Aaron, literally closed the door and started getting on a whiteboard. And one day he came in and he's like, "What are you drawing?" I showed him. It was literally the AV Hill myofibril, like the one muscle fiber curve, eccentric, isometric, concentric, and just the speed of contractions, how that affects the soft tissue. And then we started mapping out joint speeds. Okay, when we start picking up speed, what happens? And so then we started trying with these Achilles guys, isometrics to EQIs. And we started seeing the weight climb. They started to talk a certain way. We feel better. I've never seen these muscles activate like this before. When I stand up, I have no limp anymore. So when they actually were ready to do stuff, the nervous system was ready and there wasn't a giant cliff. There wasn't a cliff of internal force and external force. And so that's kind of how we think, right? Like ground reaction forces, but also the internal forces. Let's make sure that we're having a balance. And so when we go and do these faster movements outside where the ground reaction forces are massive, there isn't a giant gap. And so we just started layering stuff on, to be honest with you. And we knew from a lot of the Keith Barr work, a lot of the Dustin Orenchik work, then that bled into Dr. Frankie with all of his eccentrics. And so literally we were just like ping-ponging through research, and we had stacks and stacks and stacks we'd comb through. And so, like I said, we probably have close to 200 articles regarding around tissue mechanics, the actual joints, how they function, ground reaction forces, the neural components. Yeah, there's a lot we had to synthesize. But at the end of the day, I'm not saying we single joint train 24/7. We don't. We mix in multi-joint. We use the single joint early on, and then I will use single joint as more of a warm-up, bleed into more multi-joint. But in season, single joint is really beneficial too, because you want to throw stress through certain areas. So
Is there a certain aspect of, in terms of the multi-joint stuff, that almost has to be there because of an athlete feeling and of an athlete want
yeah,
and a need to do that because of culturally, or that's what they've always done, or anything like
I
that?
think there's still benefit to multi-joint. It's just a matter of knowing the limitations and or the response you're getting, and is that going to actually like transfer? And that word transfer is a very fancy term in a sense, sports specificity, which in my term is when they go and do their stuff on the field, do they cut, jump a certain way? Do they feel more efficient? Do they have less pain in certain areas if they have previous injuries? All these subjective measures plus objectivity of neural components, max excel, max decel, max V, stuff like that is going to kind of come together. And so we know multi-joint, there's a more load velocity relationship. And so heavier barbell loads, less speed, higher internal forces. And as we get going, as the bar weight drops, limb speed picks up, forces start to climb. We know that. And so that's where I think some people get confused a little bit is the multi-joint has a pretty good linear relationship, but we can't confuse a load velocity profile with a force velocity profile. I think they're very different.
In terms of performance measures with this approach, the
Mm-hmm.
kind of standard stuff that everyone wants to be measured against.
Yeah.
Was there been any? I'm guessing there has, because you're still doing it. And we're talking about it here. The positive uptick or downtick if you're doing speed in terms of these performance measures with this approach.
Yeah. Great response. Because at the end of the day, Rob, like all we're just looking at is we're trying to make biomechanics a little more simple, and that's like the backbone, that and some physics, and we're just trying to understand movement a little bit better. And I feel like sometimes we do get scared, but what if you have great responses? Then what are you scared from? Like you're getting the response you want. They're running better. They're running more efficient. They're faster. Oh, they're actually slamming on the brakes better, so they can actually decel better. They're getting in better positions. They're loading tissue a certain way. So now you're dispersing load across a lot of tissue and joints as opposed to one area.
Let's transition into more rehab. I mean,
Yeah.
we've been talking about rehab anyway, but this space that you've talked about and you maybe sit in, and you spoke about Ryan at the Texans, he definitely sits in. It's an interesting space that is very much developing, that people are becoming directors of rehab and sitting in between. I mean, over here it'd be physios and your S&C coaches, over there obviously PTs and ATs, and sitting in between that and the performance side. Am I right in thinking that's a developing area over there?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. It's a very developing area. And I think it's because just across the globe in sports, we're still hearing the magic word injury. And injuries they're not really going anywhere. And so I think that's why the space is growing. Um, and just kind of listen to what's going on. You're hearing hamstring strains are going up in certain sports. You're hearing certain ruptures are going up or staying the same in certain sports. But we have the most amount of technology and the most amount of research going on right now. So it's kind of an interesting time. And so, yeah, I think these staffs are growing, and I think the injury space itself and the reconditioning space is growing.
What gap is it filling? Like, what was missing before the likes of you or Ryan came into post?
Oh man, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know what the gaps were. I'll just speak from my end, and I think me personally, I really enjoy working with injured athletes. And I think if you can work with these injured athletes and apply certain principles a certain way to see them progress and hit the benchmarks that they should be at or supersede them, I think at the end of the day, that's a really powerful thing. And it's allowed me to learn in different areas. And so people always ask me, they're like, well, do you want to become a PT or a medical person at some point in time? And not necessarily. I want to help. I want to help the medical people. I want to be that, that arm that helps the strength coaches and the medical people and kind of sit in the middle and do both. And so I can apply my strength coach background and I can also apply what I've done with injured athletes and kind of bridge that gap. Um, and sometimes injured athletes can be kind of like an afterthought because you're getting the healthy guys ready or you're getting the healthy athletes ready for whatever they got to do. So I think that's where just that space is growing a little bit because of that. People are becoming more interested in injuries, and there's a lot more research coming out about tissue and how it can regenerate. So,
I feel like I stitched you up there a little bit with that question. Maybe guiding you down a place where you didn't want to be. So apologies for that. Well navigated.
no, I
So
think
you're
at the
all
end of the
right.
day, like people try and put you in these like buckets, right? Like, are you a strength coach or are you a medical person? I think in this world we could have a blend where you don't need to be a true medical person. I think as long as you understand like the core principles of injuries, and I'm not saying you have to be like an expert, just knowing like, okay, what are injury mechanisms? Where are they coming from? Um, Understanding just a little bit of simple physics, like, hey, when I slam on the brakes, what are those forces looking like versus when I accelerate? I think those will kind of give you some good understandings of like where to start.
And maybe because people have been in them buckets, there's been
Yeah,
this like
yeah,
dividing line
yeah,
versus this guy sat in the middle who kind of floats and ghosts between the two, which is often needed.
yeah. No, I think I just like learning and I like being challenged. Every injury is very different. And it allows me to learn. And that's going to allow me to progress and hopefully keep doing what I'm doing at a high level. Um, but at the end of the day, like working with these injured athletes and seeing them just progress there's a lot of fulfillment to that.
You mentioned there was a comment that you made. I don't know at what point in your career when you said you were. I think you said director of sports science. I was an assistant strength coach. Is that what you? I don't know if I was getting that right,
Yeah.
but
That's at
uh,
Washington.
yeah, okay. So at that point, what was sports science like? This
Oh
is what
man.
2018.
So I got to University of Washington. I can kind of give you a little story. I got to University of Washington in 2015. And as I got there in 2015, the staff at that time had been there for one full year. And the head coach and the head strength coach at that time, which was Chris Peterson and Tim Saha, they had 15 catapult units, and they knew that the football field and strength conditioning was going towards becoming more objective with data. They just didn't know what to do with it. And so luckily, they're like, do you want to try and learn and use it and see what we get from it? And so it was me and another strength coach at the time. And then I took it over 100%. We had 15 units, and we tried to show like, okay, what are we looking at here? And what do we make from this? And that's what bled me down reading all kinds of AFL research on hamstring injuries. And that was a good place to start, I feel like. And then that bled into us having 45 units, which covered the two deep. And we got to use it in a very proud way. I feel like we did a really good job of not having too much data, but we knew kind of like what we wanted to use it for and what it was telling us. Um, and so that was kind of like sports science in my eyes back then, was more or less like, what are the demands of football? How much do they run? How fast do they run? How much high speed yards do they run? How much change direction? So IMA data do they get? And then we started trying like whittle down like, okay, like how do we tweak certain things in the off season to help reduce certain things? One being hamstring issues. So our head coach at that time equated hamstring strains and blisters in the same sentence. They should never happen. So we're like, oh man, that's great. Like that's a great, standard to be held to. And so we did a great job of trying to just tweak things and change things. And our head strength coach did a great job with that. So that was kind of sports science in its infancy, was just trying to understand the demands of football, college football. And then from there, like it's bled into other stuff now where it's more profiling and whatever else you want to do with it.
I know sports science is a big term. Like my degree as a student was sports science, so it's obviously wide and wide ranging. But I'm always interested, especially in the US, where it feels a little bit newer than maybe like you said about Australia with the AFL, original AFL research and the 5, even probably 1 hertz units, catapult units and things like that. But I'm always interested to hear you guys over there, like what, given that description of sports science back in 2016 or 17, whatever it was, what is sports science now?
I think sports science is still very similar, and you're still trying to understand movement and the game. So the demands of the game, and then you're trying to understand like how are all these athletes um, moving within the game structures, and then how can we train them a certain way to meet those demands of the game, so that you don't have this giant cliff, right? Like so you don't have too much accels, not enough decels, and then when they go back to their team setting, that they have a bunch of decels and they're underloading accels and they get hurt. And so you're just trying to figure out like how close can we get them to the demands for their position and or their sport. And then for my area, I would take it even further and understand, okay, when you prescribe certain things, is their accel decel going up or down? And how are they responding? So is there a trend going up in a sense they're getting more efficient? They're accelerating better. So max acceleration values. Are they decelerating better? Higher max decel values over time. Are they getting more volume through that? Accels, decels, so the count, bands 1 through 3, etc. That's how I view it as, is more or less like N of 1, and then the team setting of, okay, the demands of their sport, their position, and then the whole structure. And then you're trying to understand practice versus games, are the demands being met? And if not, how do we make sure that there's still a fair parallel, so there isn't a giant cliff and forces going through tissue too often. Yeah.
Cool. I watched you referenced it already. I watched your presentation for 1080 on Achilles.
Yeah.
Watched it this morning at 6 o'clock this morning. So I've got a couple of questions on the back of that, if that's all right. I know some of this, what we've already talked about, is in there.
No, that's
so
great.
The neuro-mechanical framework and all that kind of stuff is in there already. So I would encourage people, and it's free of charge, to go on the 1080 website and just, I think, Google your name and it pops up. So tendon injuries, specifically Achilles injuries, you talk about the mechanism of injury or the mechanism for injury in that particular scenario. Talk us through that, and I think that might lead us on to some of the cool bits to dive into as well.
Oh man. Yeah. Okay, so shout out to Ola. Like he was the one, Ola and Adam at 1080. They were like, yo, like they were hearing about the progress of these Achilles guys. And Ola at first he was like, what the heck? And so then he like started listening more, and I walked through it all with him. And he's like, yo, like you gotta give this presentation. Like this is way ahead of timelines at normal for Achilles. And so starting there first, these Achilles ruptures happened. So what I did, and Aaron and I, we just started combing through just reviews. And we had to find a certain cohort, which was professional athletes. And so in professional athletes of these certain studies we found, ruptured their Achilles, what were they from? So what was the mechanism? And how long was the time frame? And so the time frame was 9 months to 18 months. And then the mechanism was weak plantar flexors. And so that kind of bled us down this path. So it's weak plantar flexors mixed in with a very abrupt accel decel action. So you're getting the stretching of that tissue. Now, as I know more now, and my nerdy self, if there is an Achilles that happens in a sport, I will literally use my phone, film it on TV, so then I can like watch this mechanism happen in slow time. I'll just scrub through the slow video and just see. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing a giant dorsiflexion action with knee extension and hip extension. So what's happening now is the calf is getting put on a massive strain from the knee extension. The ankle drops into dorsiflexion. You're stretching that tissue out. The tissue's not ready for it, and then it ruptures. So we were like, okay, if it's weak plantar flexors, which it said about 53% of the people in that review of those elite athletes had weak plantar flexors. So let's start there. And we know that if you're shortening tissue, it's less invasive than if you lengthen tissue. And so that's where we started. And that's where this whole like neuro-mechanical framework really took off, is just looking at it from a joint perspective. Flexion extension, simple. And so looking at the ankle, cool, let's get these guys sitting on a bench, legs straight out, fire that quad, go into plantar flexion as far as you can, and watch them literally shake. And so it was fascinating because there was no external load, as you'd call it, or load, but the internal load of that tissue was insane. And not only that, like the brain and the nervous system trying to figure out how much force to drive through that tissue was pretty cool to watch. So long story short, that's the Achilles mechanism. And I'm sure there's a few others, but that's the main ones. Those are the two that we kind of stumbled upon and kept coming back to. It's really weak plantar flexors, which then bleed into ankle sprains as well. And then not being able to have stiffness in the foot ankle to redirect forces, and you have that collapse.
We've gone through the neuromechanical framework. So we won't touch on that again for this example because you use this example in that little bit anyway. But in terms of benchmarks that you use along that road, is there anything key that stands out to you that you can remember that was just a bit of a turning point?
You know what? I was actually talking to my wife about this morning. We're drinking coffee, trying to get my mind like working a little bit here.
Nice. Yeah.
We didn't have force plates. We had a Nord board and we had a 1080, and we had one machine. And so Aaron and I sat there and we're like, okay, like how do we figure out benchmarks? We don't have force plates, so we can't look at left, right limbs. We can't look at force through those limbs. We can't see imbalance that way. So what actually we started doing was long lever. Sorry, you there?
Go, mate. You all right?
Long lever on the Nord board, just ISO, just prone pulls. So your long lever, knees almost extended. You know, you're in neutral ankle. Now we'd have to scoot them down to get away from that scarring of the surgical site. But at the end of the day, that was a really good way to interview the nervous system and just see how much inhibition is on the injured side or the evolved side. There was probably about a 35% imbalance of force generation from when we first started testing them, which was a few weeks after surgery. And we used that literally every 2 weeks, and we retested them in that same position to see, okay, is that force getting closer? And is the RFD going straight up? And is the impulse getting longer? In a sense, can they hold the contraction longer? Yep. So it started going sharper, started holding longer. They started feeling better. And so I think that was like the gold standard for us, was using that. And then once they were able to be upright, doing end ranges, plantar flexion holds for time. I would say that those were like the mainstays, and just understanding how the big toe and the foot work to go into plantar flexion. I think that was fascinating. And so to make it really simple, Rob, and people have asked me this, and I kind of say the same answer, plantar flexion ISOs with unloaded seated to standing to external load, then going into split positions, so split squats, so split squat ISO and deep flexion, where you're getting actual like big toe extension. It sounds very basic, but it's not. We had to layer this on. And literally we were tracing just like force tremors we talked to them. Hey, how do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel? I'm good. I'm good. And then once they were able to get upright and start marching with the 1080, we did that. And here's where it really hit us. A few days in of them marching, they looked at, both of the Achilles guys looked at Aaron and I and said, can we do this every day? And they said, whoa, what do you mean? That was going against all conventional wisdom. In a sense, you shouldn't do back-to-back days, right? Day on, day off, day on, day off. We started doing higher frequency, lower volume training. The 1080 at heavy resistance made their Achilles and their calf feel better. So we're like, shit, we're gonna keep doing it. So that way we went up to heavy. At that time it was 30 kilos, and we just kept them there until they were able to like really run. And some of the videos on that presentation are there. And then we realized we got to get them going lateral, and the lateral was unlocking a lot for the pelvis and the quad, but then also too getting rotation, pronation of the foot. So kind of going back to what you asked, the prone iso pulls that interview the nervous system to see how much they can pull in the posterior chain, which we knew the distal endpoint was going to be affected. Once that got below 10% and their force started climbing really rapidly and their RFD went up, that was a really good sign. And then we started having them stand, unload, plantar flexion, and we kind of went from there.
So good. I need to mention, we're 46 and a half minutes in. Today's your 40th birthday. Thank you for coming on.
No, it is, and I appreciate it.
Is your wife still at home?
She is. She is.
Is she?
So
she's thinking, what is that guy doing?
She's like, what is he doing
coffee,
right now?
Out with me, having coffee with me and the little one. Is it a little boy or a little girl?
Little boy. He's 5 weeks old. Yeah.
Wowza.
Little tank.
Well, that's a good thing. That's
a
good thing. I've taken 47 minutes of your time on your 40th birthday, so I think that's sufficient. And you should be getting out and having a coffee with your wife and your wife, girlfriend,
wife.
Yeah, wife, and 5-week-old son. But Kyle, thank you very much. But lastly, if anyone wants to, well, I'm going to signpost them to the 1080 website for the presentation. But in terms of socials, you're not a massive social media guy, but I know you're on socials. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So my Instagram is at Kyle_Sammons_. And I have a link tree that's kind of got a collection of stuff that I've done. If you want to just look at that, I have the 1080 link on there. I also have a few other podcasts I've done on there, which I kind of break down this framework a little bit more too. That's probably the best way. You know, I got a massive following of 1,200 followers, so.
Who cares? Who friggin' cares? No, Kyle, thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of your 40th birthday. What time is it there? 9?
It is 9:09. Yeah,
9:09.
no, I appreciate it, Rob. Appreciate
pleasure.
having me on here. It's been great chatting with you. And as you can tell, I get excited about this stuff. So
yeah, too right. No, it's great to see. And look forward to hopefully meeting you again, because I know you came to the PIT conference in June.
Yeah.
But we're spending more time in the States over the next year or two. So, hopefully catch up in person again. Yeah,
hopefully we can catch up in person again. And hopefully I can get down to the Return to Play conference you're putting on in LA. Absolutely. And that'd be great.
Yeah. No, thank you very much and happy birthday.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, mate.
Absolutely.